Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to part 3 of the Devolution recap series. This is my first time ever streaming to or using Rumble Studios. Normally I use StreamYard, but I'm doing something different, and it definitely is different. So you're gonna have to bear with me if I'm a little rusty with some of the stuff. I don't have any of my memes or anything in here, but I kind of dig this. It's interesting, but the entire chat shows up. I love that on the screen. We'll see if we get used to that. The viewership numbers. I don't know. Some of this will be a work in progress, but for those of you who are unaware, I've been doing this series. We're going through listening to Patrick's reading of my articles of my series, and I pause and give commentary and whatnot throughout. It's been quite the refresher, and we've only done 2 so far. This is part 3. I said I was going to do it only to locals, and that is what I have been doing, and then posting to Rumble later on. But I decided to kind of change things up, and because I wanted to test out this Rumble Studio thing. But we're going to go live everywhere with the devolution part of this, and then at the end of this stream, I'm going to cut off everywhere except for locals, and it's going to be a locals only Q&A for as long as it goes, and depending on the quality of the questions. So if you're not following over on locals, please do so. We'd appreciate that. Also, give the stream a thumbs up. And yeah, let's get right into it. We're going to listen to part 3. This was a fun article to write for me, and this was really when I started the series or started the Substack, got kicked off of that other social media platform. I only had like 3 articles that I figured I could write, and this is the one I was most looking forward to. The first one was kind of just like a overview. The second one was about Dong Jingwei, the defector, and that was some of the more interesting research. But this part 3 to me was like kind of the meat and potatoes of it all. It was all the couple of the weird moves that Trump made, some of the definitions of continuity government and whatnot, and just some other things. And I didn't know the series was going to go any further than that. And obviously, the more I researched, the more I found stuff. And honestly, like the best devolution article is part 13, which we'll get to later on in like, what is that, 10 weeks, I guess, since we're on part 3 now. Going to try to do this once a week. But yeah, this is a fun article. It'll be really interesting, I think, to go back through and discuss it. And we're going to do that right now. If I can figure out how to share a screen. Oh, here we go. Is that working? Oh, sweet. Okay. Man, this is so interesting. But okay. This should work. Let's do it. If you guys are having any issues, please let me know in the chat. I'm trying to pay attention to it as best I can, and we'll get rolling.
Devolution, part 3 in Patel Patriots series, Devolution. Let us begin. Continuity of operations and continuity of government. Continuity of operations, COOP, planning, has been utilized by the United States since the Cold War as an effort to preserve the continuity of government, COG.
Okay, hold on. I need to see if he puts the article on the screen at all in this.
My pseudo name.
Patrick, rookie move, bro. He did it for the first 2 articles. I don't know why he's not doing it on this one. Oh, man. Let me check one more spot. And then if I can find, I don't know if that's just a weird version of it or what, but I know the first couple episodes he did it live on Odyssey. Okay, never mind. Not available. So we're stuck with this. But hey, Patrick looks great, doesn't he? Flexing there for sure. But he looks pretty good.
This is a national security emergency. Executive Order 12656. Assignment of Emergency Preparedness Responsibilities was issued November 18, 1988 by President Ronald Reagan. It assigns national security emergency preparedness responsibilities to federal departments and agencies. EO 12656 defines a national security emergency as any occurrence, including natural disaster, military attack, technological emergency, or other emergency that seriously degrades or seriously threatens the national security of the United States. That's the Executive Order 12656, signed.
Okay, guys, what I would recommend you doing right now is go to devolution.link, come down here to part 3, and click read the article. And while you're listening to Patrick read it, and if you're not chatting or whatever, then I would follow along with this article. That's what I'm doing, and I'll pause as we go through. But to start this article, I talk about Executive Order 12656, and this was, you know, there's a whole line, almost like a lineage of moves that presidents have made relating to national preparedness, emergency preparedness, you know, continuity of government. And this is one that stemmed from 1988 President Reagan, and a lot of the more recent ones were based off of this, because Eisenhower is the one who, I mean, technically you can go back even further, but Eisenhower is the one who really during the Cold War initiated the process of a full-blown, you know, continuity of government planning. Everything stems from there. But the more modern version that we see and that we've discussed throughout the series stems from this executive order. And the big part here is the military attack. Throughout this series, we talked a lot about it being an act of war, and an act of war is something that gives Trump pretty much the full capability and authority, and especially legal authority, to basically respond however he sees fit. And we'll get into that more as we go on, maybe even later on in this article. But it's just important to note that the military attack is a big one, because he talked about COVID being a military attack. And I do believe that interfering in an election, because election infrastructure is critical infrastructure, could also be considered a military attack. But this is what I would do, guys. Follow along over on devolution.link part 3, because we only have the audio with Buff Patrick here.
By Ronald Reagan in 1988. In July of 2016, Barack Obama signed the bill classified Presidential Policy Directive 40, PPD 40. In accordance with PPD 40, each department was to maintain continuity programs. Quote, agencies were ordered to have not just a line of succession, but also one of devolution, a duplicate chain of individuals secreted outside Washington, available in a catastrophic emergency. Devolution involves procedures to transfer statutory authority and responsibilities to this secondary designated staff to sustain essential functions, end quote. Even though every federal government agency and department has continuity of government and COOP plans, what's that stand for again? Continuity of operations. COG, continuity of government. COOP, continuity of operations plans. The devolution that President Trump initiated was done through the military and the Department of Defense for one primary reason. Remember, I fully believe that we are at war, not the war you picture in your head involving thousands of troops clashing on a battlefield. This war is clandestine in nature. It involves cyber warfare, information warfare, electronic warfare, intelligence warfare, space warfare, and I also believe biological warfare, COVID. The only option at Trump's disposal was to initiate devolution using our military. I'll explain why devolution was the only option in part 4. For now, we will focus on the Department of Defense.
Okay, so a couple things here that I want to talk about, and I might actually jump forward in time to part 13 to cover some of this stuff, because it is pretty darn interesting when you kind of overlap some of this stuff. So here, when it's talking about what Barack Obama signed, it again still classified to this day, but Presidential Policy Directive 40, and this is the document, allegedly. I guess it's classified, but all of the continuity of government is basically planned off of. And if you skip ahead to part 13, this is Executive Order 13961. If you're familiar with the series already, you're very familiar with this executive order. It's one of the biggest devolution proofs I think you could possibly find. If you're new to this series, we will get there, but I do want to touch on one aspect of this, because in this executive order, it references PPD 40. Right here, it is policy of the United States to ensure national security, preservation of government structure under the United States Constitution, and in alignment with Presidential Policy Directive 40, PPD 40. And this is where it gets into the NEFs. And this is from one of those, I think this is from one of the Army brochures, I believe. PPD 40, National Continuity Policy. This is our entire country's national continuity policy. It sets forth the policy of the United States to maintain a comprehensive and effective continuity of capability through co-op and COG. So this is all very important. And we could even get into PPD 40 being the basis for Federal Continuity Directive 1 and 2. And that is where we find one of the definitions of devolution. I didn't make it up. Thomas Wichter didn't make it up. It's a real military continuity government plan, all about diversifying your assets, devolving the authorities from higher ups to lower ups to diverse locations just to perform and sustain those national essential functions. We'll get into this executive order later on, but it is interesting how it does overlap with what I was writing about in this part 3 when I hadn't even found that executive order yet. I had read it, but I didn't realize the significance yet until later on probably like my 3rd or 4th go through. But anyway, and then, yeah, being at war, this is something that's kind of definitely evolved for me, because when I wrote this, even though I knew it wasn't a warfare involving like overland battles and stuff, I still had in my head like clandestine warfare, spec ops, and maybe there is some of that going on. But the large majority of the warfare that we see, and again, at this time, I don't think I realized it. I know I didn't realize it. I didn't realize how important the narrative warfare and information warfare stuff was until part 22 and 23. That's when that clicked for me. So at this time, space warfare, electronic intelligence, all these other different types of warfare, I'm sure there are aspects of that in all this, but the primary battlefield right now is the battle for the mind. Like each and every one of you, your mind is the battlefield. It's an information war, it's a narrative war, and the good guys are kicking ass if you see where the momentum is at right now. But how's the stream going over on? Okay, just checking the chat again. I'm using Rumble Studio for the first time, and I want to make sure everything is kosher here. Okay, let's get back to Patrick's reading.
As the DoD website says, quote, the mission of the Department of Defense is to provide the military forces needed to deter war and ensure our nation's security. The Secretary of Defense oversees the Defense Department and acts as the principal defense policymaker and advisor. Here is a simplified version of the United States National Command Authority. The diagram will be in the Substack article. If Trump is going to pull...
Since he referenced it and didn't show it, I want to show you guys here quick. For those of you who aren't following along, which I would recommend you to do, it's a lot easier to follow as he reads. But this is the National Command Authority. It goes president to the Secretary of Defense. The National Security Council is an advisory role. And you can almost think of them as like the Joint Chiefs of Staff. If they were on here, I mean, I guess they are, but they are just advisory role as well. They're not actually in the chain of command. It's one thing I don't really love about this graphic. But the Secretary of Defense is such an important role, and we are going to talk about why right now.
Pull off devolution using the military, he has to have the right man at the top of the food chain as his Secretary of Defense. Just 2 days after the Associated Press declared Joe Biden as the winner of the 2020 presidential election, Donald Trump promoted Chris Miller to be acting Secretary of Defense. The former acting Secretary of Defense, in quotes, Secretary of Defense Miller, was promoted by President Donald J. Trump on November 9th, 2020. And this is about Director Miller. Miller served in the military from 1983 to 2014. He began his military career as an enlisted infantryman in the Army Reserve in 1983, and also served in the District of Columbia National Guard as a military policeman. He was commissioned as an infantry lieutenant in 1987.
Okay, hold on. Something I just kind of noticed stuck out to me. So obviously Chris Miller, talk about this guy a lot in the series, acting Secretary of Defense. No, actually, I'm just going to press play, and then we'll talk about it after this bio is over, because there's multiple points I want to make. Oh, shoot. I forgot to switch screens. Here we go.
In the initial combat operations in Afghanistan in 2001 and in Iraq in 2003 with the 5th Special Forces Group, Airborne, in addition to many follow-on deployments to both theaters. He also has extensive interagency and joint special operations experience. After retirement, Director Miller worked as a defense contractor providing clandestine special operations and intelligence expertise directly to the Undersecretaries of Defense for Intelligence and Policy.
Yeah, I want to go a little further. Actually, you know what? I'm not. I'm going to point this one thing out, and then we'll talk about the rest I want to point out after. I never noticed that back in 1983, he actually served in the District of Columbia National Guard as a military policeman. And I'm not sure if it's 100% relevant. This is more speculation, but just based on everything that went down with J6 and the DC National Guard, that seems notable to me now. And I've never noticed that before. So I'm going to think on that, chew on that a little bit more, but that is interesting. I wonder if there's anybody else that's like maybe in the chain of command at the DC National Guard that he served with back then or at the time. I don't know, but I thought that was an interesting nugget. And yeah, let's keep going. Once we get through the entirety of his little section here, I'll discuss some of the things I didn't notice back then that are obviously much more important now, in my opinion. So we'll keep going here.
One of his last assignments as an Army officer was as Director for Special Operations and Irregular Warfare within the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations / Low Intensity Conflict, ASD-SO/LIC. Keep that in mind because it will come up a lot. The ASD-SO/LIC is responsible for the overall supervision of special operations and low-intensity conflict activities. In other words, the ASD-SO/LIC oversees the entire United States Special Operations Command, USSOCOM. Here are the USSOCOM core activities: direct action, special reconnaissance, unconventional warfare, foreign internal defense, civil affairs operations, counterterrorism, military information support operations, counter-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, security force assistance, counterinsurgency, hostage rescue and recovery, foreign humanitarian assistance. The one I want to focus on is foreign internal defense. Activities that support a host nation's internal defense and development strategy, IDAD, designed to protect against subversion, lawlessness, insurgency, terrorism, and other threats to their internal security, stability, and legitimacy. Doesn't that sound relevant?
Okay, so if I could go back in time, I mean, these are all very interesting. And the one I pointed out, national or nation's internal defense, I do think that is important. But in the context of what they mean by the military, it's like they're talking about foreign nations. And under a devolution situation, they could definitely be implementing something like this. But the one that I didn't even highlight really back then, because I didn't realize how important it was, is this military information support operations, MISO. That is PSYOPs. They've renamed it a couple times throughout its history, but this is PSYOPs. This is the fourth PSYOP group. And like this is everything that we've been going through right now. And I didn't even realize it back then. It's just kind of funny to me that that's the case. Well, I want to look up one more thing. And guys, if you are watching, make sure you give this a thumbs up. A reminder that we are going to do this entire article, and then afterwards I'm going to do a Q&A only on locals. So if you're watching below this, here, let me share my screen and show you. Right here on this join, this red join button, if you click that, that'll take you over to locals. And that's where you can sign up and you can follow the Q&A and participate over there if you want. More of a personal thing, but yeah, anyway, that was an interesting nugget for sure. But yeah, the foreign internal defense, I never really went back to this. And maybe I should, to see how much of it lines up with what we're going through now, because just on the surface level, by definition, it sounds like it perfectly lines up, and this Chris Miller would be a perfect guy to handle it, which is why I think he was implemented in there as acting Secretary of Defense.
Secretary of Defense Miller began working for the Trump administration in March of 2018, serving various roles within the National Counterterrorism Center. He became director of the NCC, National Counterterrorism Center, in August of 2020, a position he held until his promotion to acting Secretary of Defense. While with the National Counterterrorism Center, he had a brief stint, June 19th, 2020 to August 7th, 2020, where he was, quote, performing the duties of ASD SOLIC until he was replaced by Ezra Cohen-Watnik.
Okay, I know this is confusing. It's even confusing for me to get it back again, but these positions are important. There's this weird like overlap with a lot of these key figures that I talk about in the series, and it's those are always interesting to me. Like a position that was held by Christopher Miller, he leaves, and then it's filled by Ezra Cohen-Watnik, and both those guys played huge role, and they both have a special operations background. I mean, that's notable stuff, even though it's confusing and whatnot. But yeah, Christopher Miller, his background, he's such a key figure in all this. I truly believe so. But now we're going to start going through some of these other individuals that, I believe are important, some more than others. And so these are all interesting as well. And I'll point out, so we're about to talk about Anthony Tata. You know what? I'll save the story until we listen to it here.
The ASD-LOIC, let me just make sure I understand what that stands for. The Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations / Low Intensity Conflict. Okay. Lost yet? Within days, his promotion to Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller and Trump began making moves within the Department of Defense and the Pentagon that many considered unusual. On November 10th, Anthony Tata was promoted to senior official performing the duties of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. The USDP happens to be the primary coordinator for Department of Defense Directive 3020.26, which, quote, establishes DoD continuity policy and assigns responsibilities for its implementation. In other words, one of the very first positions filled after Chris Miller became acting Secretary of Defense was the position that, quote, develops DoD policy and provides oversight for continuity of operations and continuity of government. I'm going to read that again, okay? This is important. In other words, one of the very first positions filled after Chris Miller became acting Secretary of Defense was the position in the DoD that develops DoD policy and provides oversight for continuity of operations, COOP, and continuity of government, COG. Anthony Tata, is also an author who writes Tom Clancy-style military thrillers. He published a book in November of 2019 called Double Crossfire. The book has an interesting description. In the most shocking scenario of our time, former Brigadier General Anthony J. Tata takes you inside a brilliantly conceived, brutally executed plot to overthrow our government from within. We'll just call that one a coincidence.
Okay, so this is fascinating. This guy, especially the novel part of it. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely notable that one of the first positions they fill once we get a new Secretary of Defense in there is the guy that's going to oversee the continuity of government stuff. Until later on, we'll see in Part 13, which happens later, they switch it from him to, in my opinion, Robert O'Brien, and I'll show you what I mean later on. But the reason there's a funny story behind Anthony Tata. So pretty much every key player in the Devolution series, I have attempted to contact and interview. Like later on, we find out that Anthony Tata and Christopher Miller went on to start this Boundary Channel Partners. Let me just pull it up here and show you what I'm talking about. Okay. So this is from my Part 13. Again, I know we're skipping forward a little bit, but after leaving office, Chris Miller co-founded Boundary Channel Partners. He co-founded it with Mr. Tata, so the guy I just mentioned. And so I sent multiple messages to this, like through this foundation. They have like a contact thing asking for interviews, and I never got a response. Not once. Never a single response. They never would. And there's multiple people I've tried to reach out to, never get a response. But Anthony Tata one time, after a power hour where we were going through some of this stuff, I get a message on Twitter. We were talking about Tata and his book. It was, I know it was me and Patrick on the show. And he messaged me. I'm not going to show what it says, but he said, "Thanks for the shout out on your show by P. Gunnels. Have a good weekend." And I was like, holy shit. Holy thank you. Is this actually you, the former USDP? He says, "Roger that." And then had a bunch of followers added today, and it was a result of your podcast. So that's what he said. You know what? Maybe I will just show this so you guys see them. So you know I'm not lying to you. Hold on. Okay. I'm not gonna, just so you know what I'm reading from. Anthony Tata, thanks for the shout out. Have a great weekend. Holy thank you. Is it actually you? He sent a copy of the book. Wondering if you're, this is what I asked him after he asked me to give a shout out for his new book that's coming out. I said, "I'll definitely do that. Wondering if you're familiar with my work at all. I'd love to chat sometime about all the interesting moves made by Trump while you were the USDP and before Biden was inaugurated." Says he's been keeping his head down, would like to discuss. And then later on, he clarifies discuss privately, taking a step back. And then after that, he has not since responded. So to me, it was like he knew, or he didn't realize who I was, or didn't know who I was or whatever. He was just like, "Oh, cool. Thanks for the shout out." And then I acknowledged like, "Hey man, can't believe you actually did this. Would love to talk." Most people who don't read my stuff, or most people that I talk about in my series won't talk to me. And then once he realized who I was or what I was writing, it's like he never wants to talk to me again. So kind of crazy. Anyway, let's get back to this.
Next, David Norquist. David Norquist was already serving as the Deputy Secretary of Defense from July 31st to February 8th of 2021. His role was to oversee the day-to-day operations as well as manage the Department of Defense budget. Prior to that role, he was...
Yeah, hold on. I just want to comment on something. A couple of people in the chat. What I'm trying to say is I don't think he understood that I wrote the Devolution series when he reached out. Once he realized that, that is why he stopped responding. Because I sent him other stuff. We've given him shout outs on the show. I think I even invited him to a conference, like trying to just like promote his book or whatever, because clearly that is something that he sent me a random out of the blue thank you for mentioning his book on a podcast, and he got followers from it. So he's like keeping his eye on stuff. But then again, once I mentioned that people that I write about in my series normally won't talk to me, and so it was surprising that he was, when he's highlighted in my series, that's when he cut off communication, almost cold turkey. So that is why that is interesting and kind of funny. But hopefully someday when this all blows over, it'll allow me to buy him a drink or something, because I would like to talk to him at some point.
Essentially the CFO of the DoD. He oversaw the first ever department-wide financial audit of $2.7 trillion in assets. I mention him for two reasons. First, as somebody who knows the Department of Defense finances inside and out, he is the type of guy you would need if you're looking to fund special operations that you don't want anybody to know about. Second, you're going to see a memo shortly that he sent out, which to me proves he was involved in devolution. November 11th, 2020 involved the promotion of two more Trump allies.
Okay, I just want to touch on this guy really quick, Nordquist. I'm not 100% sure what his role is, but I know this is notable because he was promoted. He's essentially the CFO of the DoD. He saw the first audit of the DoD pretty much ever, department wide. That's what it says. I mean, $2.7 trillion in assets. The memo that we're going to show later is the most interesting part. But since this article, I haven't really found any key like pieces of evidence that point to like, hey, this is he's in there, he's part of this. But I know there has to be some sort of funding mechanism for whatever's going on behind the scenes. There just has to be. I'm sure some of it is roped into just regular funding and bills that Congress passed, and they're just not even aware what they're actually funding. But there has to be some other stuff too. I mean, it can't be fully that way. I mean, maybe it can. I don't know for sure. Again, I don't have any inside info and I don't know the full details, but yeah, this is certainly, he's a player with the memo that we're going to see. But other than that, I haven't found any specifics in the evidence. And now we're going to talk about Kash Patel and Ezra Cohen-Watnik. And this Kash Patel thing breaks my heart to this day. Now I'll explain that here shortly.
Kashyap Patel, my pseudo namesake, goes by Kash, and Ezra Cohen-Watnik, each deserving of their own chapter in this story. Kash Patel. Kash Patel was promoted to Chief of Staff for Acting Secretary of Defense Miller. He played a major role in uncovering the corruption of the Democrat Party during both Spygate and the Ukraine scandal. He is a lawyer who was a legal liaison to the Joint Special Operations Command. It was even rumored he was being considered to lead the CIA to replace Gina Haspel. As Chief of Staff for Secretary of Defense Miller, Patel would have been intimately involved with the operations planning. He was also designated to lead the DoD's coordination with Biden's transition team. More on that shortly. Ezra Cohen-Watnik. Ezra Cohen-Watnik was promoted to fill the role of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, UDI, the top Pentagon civilian overseeing intelligence. While in this role, he also continued to serve as the Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. He was working as both the UDI, Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, and the ASD SOLIC from November 11th to January 20th. Guess who directly reports to the UDI, the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence? The Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. If you're not sure why that is relevant, go back and read part 2 of my Devolution series.
Okay, let me discuss a few things here first. So yeah, part 2 in the Devolution series, Dong Jingwei defects to the United States. He bypasses CIA, FBI, goes directly to the DIA, which is the military intelligence branch. And the Biden administration didn't know about it. If you want a full recap of that entire saga, go watch the recap part 2 on Rumble. But okay, let's start with Kash. So when I started following politics, right? I talked about this before. I was over on Twitter following Brian Cates. That got me to Thomas Wichter. When everybody got booted off of Twitter, I went to Quod Verum. I was over there for a while. I originally got booted off of Quod Verum, okay? And I was just going to like disappear, whatever. I decided to come back under a pseudonym because at the time I think I went by King Gerald, which is like Jon Herold Gerald. That was like a nickname I use or whatever. That's what I was going by, King Gerald. I came back as Patel Patrick. It's like, no, I love writing about this stuff. I truly enjoyed the research. I wasn't going to be able to stay away. And I had just watched the movie A Plot Against the President, which Kash Patel is like heavily featured in, and he's a super badass. And as I was sitting there trying to think of a name, I was like, oh, I'll just do Patel Patriot because huge fan of Kash Patel, right? And so that is why I chose Patel Patriot. I had no idea I was ever even going to leave that Quod Verum site. I had no idea I was going to start a Substack or any of that stuff. It just, that all stuff just happened to happen. And choosing Kash, like I could have chose any number of names, but I happened to choose Kash Patel. And why it breaks my heart, like I said earlier, is because over the course of, being on social media, writing this series and everything, there has been some animosity that I've gotten thrown my way from Kash Patel and some people in Kash Patel's circle. And, it's unfortunate because I am like huge fan. And I was actually I met him at Mar-a-Lago, so I did get a picture with him. But yeah, I believe personally that the reason there's animosity is because I use Patel, and some people out there confuse, or, oh, I thought this was Kash Patel. From day one, maybe next week I'll get the screenshots pulled up or this little video I put together. From day one, anytime anybody would ever ask if I was Kash Patel, this was before I had my face out there and my real name was doxxed, I would always say, no, I'm just a big fan. Like, no, I'm not Kash Patel. I'm just a big fan. But yeah, so the animosity part sucked. But I think it's because I used his name and I wrote about what I wrote about. And if I'm right about what I wrote about, that does kind of put him in an awkward spot and a bad spot. Because I do believe he did play a role. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he's just mad because I legitimately used Patel Patriot and people thought I was him and thought I was grifting off his name. But that was never my intention. But even this picture, when I went up to him at Mar-a-Lago and I was like, introduced myself, apologized, it was awkward. Like you could tell he knew I was, and you could tell he was not happy. It was just weird, but it is what it is. I still to this day am a big fan, even though he's blocked me on True Social and he's made a few comments on True Social and at some of his public speaking stuff about the other Patel guy or whatever. It is what it is. But then, yeah, Ezra Cohen-Watnik, definitely an interesting character. He's like an enigma. He is like, you don't see much from him, at least until once the Israel war started. He's been going off on Twitter. But before that, like, it was like he didn't post much. But now, like, he's actually engaged with me a few times. Like, there was one time he responded to one of my tweets. Yeah, it's just he's so interesting. But I know he plays a role, like his background and everything, his role, which we discuss in part like 23, which is even further than this, like beyond just the acting Secretary of Defense for Special Ops and Low Intensity Conflict. There was stuff earlier on in the administration having to do with Flynn and the Spygate stuff and Devin Nunes. Like, all these players are connected, and it's so damn interesting. But his role is definitely important, having not just the ASD-SOLIC, but also being the Undersecretary of Defense for intelligence, being in an intelligence war, like an information war. That it's so notable. But he denies all this on Twitter, obviously. But anyway, yeah, let's keep going through this. I think we get into the part here where he was brought in by Mike Flynn and some of his other background stuff.
Ezra was first brought into the NSC by General Michael Flynn. He has experience with the DIA, CIA, Defense Clandestine Service, and the National Security Council. Okay.
There was a comment in the chat I just wanted to address. Divya108 says, just respectfully wondering, why didn't you change your name if it caused problems? You know, I struggle with that, and I did change it everywhere. Like, every social media site you go to, my name is displayed, Jon Herold. I just use the handle at Patel Patriot, because that is what my entire series was based off of. You know, it's and I still think of myself as doing this like with it, like almost as homage, you know, like still a huge fan. And it's kind of hard to like change a majority of that stuff after you've started. I mean, I could go start fresh, but then I could potentially lose the platform that I've built, and that's a tough pill to swallow too. So I've been upfront about it from day one that I am not Kash Patel, and I go by Jon Herold everywhere. And I've been doxxed, and I show my face. Like, I don't look like Kash Patel. I don't look Indian. So just saying.
He was also appointed by Trump to chair the Public Interest Declassification Board in December of 2020, a position that would prove useful if you wanted to timely release previously classified information to the public. I know this is confusing, but I promise I'm going somewhere with this.
Okay, about this Ezra Cohen-Watnik being on the Public Interest Declassification Board, I mean, it was super interesting that he was the chair of that. Trump appointed this guy to be the chair of that. That is beyond notable. That is a huge nugget. But I was expecting more to come from that. You know what I mean? Like, because his time as chair, it expired after 3 years, and I think he might still be on the board, but I don't. He's not the chair anymore, and so I don't think we've seen the end of the declassification saga. There's no way. There had to be a bigger reason for Trump appointing this man, Ezra Cohen-Watnik, to chair that Public Interest Declassification Board. And I don't think we've seen anything. I mean, we have seen some things come out, some of the, JFK stuff, some 9/11 stuff, I think, but there's more. We know there's so much more that needs to come out. And because we haven't seen that yet, I believe that there's something bigger there that's coming. You know what I mean? So just super interesting and almost random, right? Like Ezra Cohen-Watnik, this guy, he's in Special Forces. He's head of Spec Ops and head of intelligence or whatever the civilian highest level civilian in charge of intelligence, and he's just thrown on this public interest declassification board. Seems too random to be just random.
Special operations and low-intensity conflict. On November 18th, 2020, Secretary of Defense Miller signed this memorandum designating the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict as a, quote, principal staff assistant, which would report directly to the Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary of Defense. So Ezra Cohen-Watnik would be reporting directly to Secretary of Defense Miller. Even more interesting was the memo released shortly thereafter by Deputy Secretary of Defense Norquist, titled Development of an Implementation Plan for a Direct Reporting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. I'll skip the actual text of the whole memo. We've got the gist.
Okay, so let me see where he goes with this.
Why is this significant? Because this is who is running devolution right now.
We'll talk about that part in a second, but I want to come back and talk about this. So this November 18th thing is pretty darn big. Taking away the bureaucratic red tape from this stuff, that was like Trump's MO. He did that all throughout his presidency with a lot of these bureaucratic institutions, especially the military. He did this with cyber operations, which I think is huge. Cybercom, cut the red tape there. NSPM 13, that was all about cutting the red tape. NSPM 20, and that's National Security Presidential Memorandum. We'll get to that later on in the series. But Trump was constantly cutting red tape. And this one, the timing of it, coming after the stolen election, shortly after Chris Miller is established as the acting Secretary of Defense, and then shortly after Ezra Cohen-Watnik is placed as this, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Spec Ops and Low-Intensity Conflict, they cut that red tape, something they could have done a lot sooner, especially when you know that Trump was already doing that stuff. So why didn't this happen before? What was it, because Esper was in there? Or was it Esper? Oh, shit. Now I can't remember. Who was the Secretary of Defense before Chris Miller? I'm pretty sure it's Esper. But I feel like I'm having a brain fart. You guys ever have those moments you say something, you might be right, but it feels like you're having a brain fart? That's what I feel like is happening right now. But anyway, cutting this red tape is important, and I talk about this later on in the series 2, part 22. That is this speech that Ezra Cohen-Watnik gave when they signed this document and they cut that red tape. It was this speech, and this is such a cool speech. I have all the words here, but remember the statue, the bronze Bruce. I mean, I talk about all this later on. We'll get to this, but this is such a huge moment, I think, in what we're witnessing play out. I think a lot of it happened because of this here. This is allowing some of this stuff to take place. And then this memo, this is where I was talking about earlier, David Norquist. I'm not 100% sure what his role is, other than like there's got to be funding for this somewhere. But when I pointed out this memo has to do with this move. And specifically in here, to facilitate development of this implementation plan, I will lead regular meetings beginning the week of November 30th, 2020. If you go back in time, at the end of that first week, or it would have been the first week following, was when Executive Order 13961 was signed, December 7th, 2021 or 2020. But he was overseeing the implementation of Spec Ops reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. That has to be notable, right? It's a guess, it's speculation, but it seems like it should be notable. Now, this is where we're going to play this part. Patrick had just read that this whole thing is significant because this is who is running devolution right now. Kind of cringed when he read that because I don't know for sure who is. This is all speculation. This is who I believe, like some of these players I believe are running aspects of this. But then also like some of these players over the course of the last couple of years have become much more public. And much more public in their appearances. Chris Miller going on podcasts and interviews. Cash Patel's always out there doing his foundation work, the lawfare stuff, representing Trump, his own foundation. Like he's all over the place. Ezra Cohen-Watnik is more active on social media. Stuff like that makes me believe. I mean, it's not a sure thing. We don't know. We don't know the capabilities or the full scope of what's going on. But when I see people are playing a much more active role publicly, to me, that means they're probably not playing as big of a role anymore behind the scenes. Like maybe some of their role was just to planning, and the devolved aspect of this is still within the hands of other people that we have no idea who they are. You know what I mean? So there's so many aspects of this that even though you can see the evidence, the circumstantial evidence all over the place, it's always so fascinating to me how little we truly know about what is going on. Even though it's like this giant black hole, right? Like you can see the effects of it all over the place, but you don't know what's actually in there. You don't know what that is and what makes it up. And that will forever be fascinating to me until we get a full painted picture. But we'll keep going here with Patrick.
Check out this screenshot from DJT's Federal Mission Resilience Strategy he released on December 30th. I'm going to go into the FMR shortly. It describes how our special ops are operating a devolution of government right now. And here, I'm going to read this one to you. The routine and regular performance of assess and distribute, managed through a governance structure which reinforces accountability at all levels of government. Sustainment depends on the successful conduct of assessment and distribution. Sustain refers to the ability to continue the direction and performance of essential functions and services to the required minimum performance levels throughout the course of realized impacts from one or more threats. Sustainment throughout disruption can be implemented at proactively distributed operational locations, devolution locations, or through other mitigation efforts. Under day-to-day operations, sustainment could be carried out at multiple distributed locations, while other locations, e.g. relocation, devolution, and alternative processes, are leveraged to support realized threat operations.
Okay, so this, I'm so stupid, guys. This was part 3, okay? I'm in part 3. I'm talking about why this all is important, this whole letter and memo from David Norquist and the switching of the spec ops and everything, reporting directly to the acting Secretary of Defense. And I take a screenshot here from Trump's Federal Mission Resilience Strategy and highlight how it literally says devolution in this thing, okay? This Federal Mission Resilience Strategy. This is part 13. That's from part 13. Executive Order 13961 was released on December 7th, and in conjunction with that came this Federal Mission Resilience Strategy. So as soon as I wrote this first article, or this third article, whatever, in my initial stages of research, I knew this was important, but I didn't realize how important this was. And for whatever reason, it didn't click for me till later on. And I'll tell the story about that once we get to that article. But in part 3 of my series, one of the first things I wrote, I was discussing Executive Order 13961. I just did not realize the significance of it, even though it literally spells out devolution inside that thing. So just fascinating stuff. I'm such an idiot sometimes, most times.
Okay, back to Patel. Special operations and low-intensity units perform small-scale, covert, and clandestine operations. At the time of this memo, the one we just read, acting ASD SOLIC is Ezra Cohen-Watnik. Ezra is also the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. He is the top civilian official overseeing our military intelligence and the top civilian official overseeing our special operations forces. He has just been designated to directly report to Secretary of Defense Miller, the most recent ASD SOLIC. That's Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict.
God, these acronyms are so confusing. If you're not following along, and even if you are following along on the articles, part 3, they're confusing as hell. So don't worry if you're lost. You get the gist of what's going on.
Special Operations Secretary. Okay, there we go. Remember earlier, I told you Miller's last role with the Army was as Director for Special Operations and Irregular Warfare within the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. Secretary of Defense Miller knows the ins and outs of the Special Operations Command. He has personally led some of the units. He trusts them because he is one of them. Secretary of Defense Miller was asked to implement something that had never been done before. The fate of the United States of America is hanging in the balance based on the success of this one operation.
Okay, I apologize for being a little dramatic with that writing there, but I blame Patrick for making it sound more dramatic than it really is. And where is Patrick? Because what happened? He was so jacked in this. He's still pretty jacked now, but not this jacked. Somebody's got to get his attention on Twitter or something. Tell him to come watch. He was actually going to join me, but I think we might do that next week.
He literally had the weight of the world on his shoulders. So he turned to the people he knew he could trust to get the job done. These units specialize in protecting against the subversion, lawlessness, insurgency, terrorism, and other threats to their internal security, stability, and legitimacy. This is exactly the group you want to run a devolution operation. I believe the implementation plan meetings beginning in the week of November 30th was the implementation of devolution. It's no wonder Secretary of Defense Miller made these off-script comments to VP Mike Pence at the first anniversary of the founding of Space Force. Here's what he said. We've been through some stuff. We've gone through some of the most complex military operations this country has ever conducted, and your steady hand and your leadership during those was a great source of strength for me. He had been in this position for little over a month. If it wasn't devolution, what could he be referring to as the most complex military operations this country has ever seen?
All right. So again, guys, apologies that Patrick didn't show the actual article on this one. It is easier to pay attention and focus on what he's talking about when it's on the screen, but I think in the future ones he did. But this part here too. So where was it? Okay. When I say I believe the implementation plan meetings beginning the week of November 30th was the implementation of devolution, I mean, it's possible. I almost wish I wouldn't have said that because I don't know that for sure. I mean, I do clarify it's just a belief, but I don't know. I think one of the things that's definitely evolved in my line of thinking since we've gone for like 3 years since I started writing this thing. It's how long prior to this they've potentially been planning it. And I do think it goes back further. I can't put a date on it. I don't know. But I don't think they just like all of a sudden, like December or November 10th or whatever it was when Trump puts Chris Miller in there, then they start to like, okay, well, we'll probably have to implement devolution or something. I think they knew well before the stolen election. I think they knew well before the October, what was it? Oh, shoot. Hold on. I just don't want to get it's the regular warfare annex to the national security strategy, I believe is what it's called. I just don't want to misquote anything here. Yep, here we go. The irregular warfare annex to the national defense strategy. So this was put out October 2nd. This was put out by Ezra Cohen-Watnik. And this is everything we're going through right now. This is from part 22. We'll talk about that later on. But I think it was well before that. I mean, who knows how far you can go back. But when you see how much overlaps with the Q stuff and devolution, maybe it's beyond kind of our comprehension, how far back the planning of this goes. I don't know how much control they really have. It's definitely interesting stuff. Was there anything else I want to comment on? Yes, I do think Mike Pence is still a patriot. I'm probably a little less on the bandwagon of him being VP. I think it's a possibility. I've been getting more excited about Robert O'Brien getting the nod, but really anybody in the devolution orbit, I think would be big. But we don't need to get into that. I don't want to piss anybody off. So, even though I probably just did.
Transition team. Look at this article from late December of 2020. Really quite shocking. Inside the ugly transition at the Pentagon from Politico. But people with the transition said the outgoing team's conduct went far beyond the norm and pointed to loyalists installed by the White House as the main reason for the obstruction. Pentagon officials under President Donald Trump refused to provide information about current operations, particularly in the special operations realm, because they are, quote, pre-decisional. That means the Biden team now has limited visibility into key operational issues, including what counterterrorism missions are in the works. End quote. Remember, Kash Patel was designated to lead the transition on behalf of the Department of Defense. He, along with Secretary of Defense Miller and the rest of Trump's allies, refused to provide information about current operations, particularly in the special operations realm. That would be the same realm from the memo above. This is unprecedented in terms of presidential transitions.
Okay, so I just want to say, Ash is going live here shortly with Culture of Change. Ash, I'll send all these people over there. We'll rate them once this is done. So we're getting close to the end here. And no, Patrick is not reading this live. This was from back in like July of 2021. So as always, though, we are wondering what the hell is Patrick wearing? Because that might as well just be like he should make that a shirt. Like, what the hell is Patrick wearing? Badlands should make a shirt. But yeah, so this is all this transition stuff is very interesting too. When you look at it in the context of, like, if you look at it on its own, it's like, okay, well, that's weird. Trump's just being a dick. That's what the mainstream media was kind of portraying it to be. But that's not true. When you look at it in the context of everything else that we think is going on, the change, the transition, the stuff implementing devolution, it makes this so much more interesting that Trump's Pentagon, Trump's DOD, was refusing to provide information about current operations, especially ones in special operations. That is damn interesting when you think of, hey, maybe they're planning some sort of devolution op and they're not filling in the Biden administration. And this goes back to stuff we've talked about recently on some of our shows, the Devolution Power Hour. You can almost find circumstantial evidence where it appears that the current Biden administration, the current, heads of the Pentagon, whatever, it's like they're cut off from intelligence. And they may have been cut off from day one when you look at an article like this. That makes it more interesting. That's notable. And we'll keep going here.
So, to recap, Trump prepares for election theft. China colludes with Democrats to steal election. Trump caught them all and prepares his counter move. Massive personnel moves at the DOD and Pentagon to place Trump allies in key roles. Implementation of what appears to be a devolution plan for our special operations teams. Refusing to tell incoming Dems about said special operations. Checkmate. In closing, on December 7th.
Okay, so the closing part of this article, you guys can go out here and read it if you want. But again, this is on December 7th, Trump issued Executive Order 13961. Huge devolution proof, everything. Again, I mentioned it here. I put in the whole entire strategy that was released in conjunction with it. I more so was focusing on this strategy, realizing like, okay, this is pretty notable considering we think there's a devolution thing going on. But I didn't realize how notable. I didn't actually go through and break down the executive order till later on. But so we're going to listen to Patrick read this. And then we're going to jump over to, I'll send you guys over to Ash's stream. I'll turn this into the locals only Q&A. But before we do any of that, I do want to get a quick word from a sponsor of ours. So it's time to say goodbye to Starbucks and say hello to Rumble's 1775 coffee. Unlike other brands, this is a coffee that backs free speech and is unapologetic about it. Visit 1775coffee.com. Use the promo code STUDIO, and you can get 15% off. Coffee comes in medium and dark roasts. It also comes in pea berry, which is a similar to Kona coffee. In other words, this stuff is premium. Click the link in the live chat or the description. You can also go directly to 1775coffee.com and use promo code STUDIO to get 15% off today. And who doesn't love a good coffee, guys? I know I do. I'm a big fan of like trying different brands of coffees. And honestly, like I'm not a coffee snob in the slightest. Like you could put the best coffee in the world in front of me and then like your average gas station coffee. And honestly, I probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And maybe that's just me. I'm the same way with whiskeys. Like you could put a $150 shot whiskey in front of me and a 50-cent shot of whiskey in front of me. They're both whiskey to me, right? So when I go to buy coffee, it's because of the people who support my values. And it does seem that there's so few of those available out there. And so seeing somebody like this, 1775 Coffee, supporting stuff like Badlands and other creators on Rumble and Rumble generally and free speech generally, that's what we got. You got to make that transition to support the people who share your morals and your values. I know most of you people watching probably already do that, but when given the opportunity, when you are able to, these companies and Badlands, we appreciate your support. We truly do. So 1775coffee.com. I'm going to put that in the description of this video right now, so you guys can go check that out. And thank you to Rumble for providing them as a sponsor for today's show. Hold on. There we go. So if you refresh this this feed in the description box, you'll see the 1775coffee.com. Go check it out and use promo code STUDIO for 15% off. All right. Okay, let's get back to this. We're going to listen to Patrick read the rest of this, and then we'll go over to locals and do a little Q&A, tell you what's going on in my life.
2020. President Trump signed Executive Order 13961, Governance and Integration of Federal Mission Resilience. And on December 30th, he released the Federal Mission Resilience Strategy 2020. When you have the time, I urge you to read both. I can discuss the executive order and strategy in detail in a future post if people would like that. But for now, I'm only going to show the intro from Donald Trump and then the very last summary section of the FMR document. Notice the timing here. As this was released, Trump had already started putting devolution into motion. Keep that in mind as you read it. It's almost like he's telling you he is about to do something big.
Yeah, so I honestly recommend go to devolution.link and follow along. Devolution.link, you can go to part 3. Oops, that's not part 3. Here's part 3. Part 3, scroll down to the bottom under closing and follow along as Patrick reads the FMR strategy. This was released in conjunction with the biggest devolution proof pretty much that we have, Executive Order 13961. And what Trump says in this FMR, this is signed by him. Trump wrote this. I mean, maybe he didn't actually write it himself. I don't know. But Trump signed his name to it. He approved every word. We've gotten some background on how Trump writes his tweets and everything. So he's very particular about how things get put out in his name. This is so important. So devolution.link, click on part 3, follow along, and just soak this in.
Federal Executive Branch. Here's the memo, guys. In support of my administration's national security strategy, this is Trump, I am issuing the Federal Mission Resilience Strategy, hereafter the strategy, to address the long-term challenges of political, economic, and military competition from near-peer adversaries, as well as disruptions from natural disasters and pandemics. Our adversaries...
Hold on. So I just already paragraph 1, interesting stuff. Okay, he's issuing the FMR to address long-term challenges. Long-term challenges. Like that to me is what, when you think of this all in the context of devolution, and he goes on to say, you know, competition from near peer adversaries, but also disruptions from other things like natural disasters, pandemics. Later on in the series, when you get into the nuts and bolts of the stuff, like he's almost quoting continuity government here, like disruptions from natural disasters. And what, actually, if we go up here, yeah, so EO 12656, which lays out the responsibility for emergency preparedness and continuity government and everything. A lot of the stuff, as I said earlier, is based off of this. They talk about national security emergency, including national disasters, military attack, other emergencies, whatever, anything that seriously degrades or threatens the national security of the United States. So you come back down to the FMR, and that's exactly what he's talking about. He's referencing continuity of government just in this first paragraph by what he says here. It's fascinating stuff.
Adversaries will not attempt to fight us on our terms. They have studied our way of war, invested in capabilities to target our strengths, and are adept at competing below the threshold of armed conflict. Adversarial threats are not the only source of disruption. Disruptions from wildfires, natural disasters, and pandemics such as the COVID-19 pandemic highlight the importance of an integrated risk management approach to prioritize essential functions and services.
You know, very early on in the series, my mindset was very focused on the act of war needed was COVID, and that is what gave him the authority and everything to implement devolution. I think what's evolved since then is the stolen election aspect. Like I think my thought process has shifted more so to that is what the impetus is. But you cannot ignore COVID-19 because Trump also told us that they use COVID to steal the election. They kind of go hand in hand, which is why when we're looking forward, I almost feel like I keep saying I think they're going to steal the election again. Like, what is the point of stealing the election from somebody and then just allowing them back in using the same method that you stole it from him in the first place? Like, it doesn't make sense. But anyway, that's besides the point. I think there's going to be another, like impetus for stealing that election, whether it's another pandemic or something else. Who knows? Like, I think there's going to be something that shakes things up a little bit that is going to allow them to once again change the rules, do all these things to steal the election. Or maybe they're just in our face about it, kind of like they were in 2020, just more so. I don't know, but that's my thought process. Or they're just going to cancel the whole damn thing altogether.
This strategy accelerates our collective efforts to fully implement national continuity policy and make risk-informed decisions to maintain a comprehensive and effective capability that ensures the continuous performance of essential functions and services to preserve our constitutional form of government under any and all conditions. As the executive branch, we must recommit and sustain leadership's attention on meeting the needs of the American people in the face of disruptions and preserving our form of government. Despite our best efforts, the government cannot
I'll let him finish this.
Prevent all dangers.
Okay, I want to come back to this because what they say here, they're talking about all these different scenarios, right? Possibility of unforeseen events, natural disasters, pandemics, cyber threats, kinetic or electromagnetic pulse attacks. We must be prepared, all these things. Nowhere in any of these documents that I've looked do they ever specifically mention like stolen election, right? Somebody steals an election. But when you look at all the stuff they're talking about as reasons to implement a continuity government plan, in my opinion, some of these things, like a natural disaster, yes, those are terrible. Pandemics, yes, those are terrible. All these different things are terrible. But when you're talking about your constitutional form of government, the most like the worst offense that I could imagine to a constitutional form of government is an unconstitutional, unelected communist getting placed in office. Like when it comes to, I mean, there's a difference to me between like stuff that threatens the nation and stuff that actually threatens your constitutional form of government, which is what this whole thing is talking about. And what I think the whole reason Trump walked away. And so while it's interesting to me that they don't ever mention, election fraud or stealing an election or subversion, all that stuff, I think it's almost implied. And I think it's almost important to me that he didn't mention, I think it's notable that he didn't actually mention stolen election in this when they talked about, okay, think about it. This election was stolen November 3rd. And sorry, I'm like piecing this together as I'm going. Election was stolen November 3rd. This executive order 13961 was released on December 7th. It was definitely written, in the weeks, days prior, whatever. We don't know how long this document was ready. But when you look at the FMR strategy, which was released in conjunction with it, this sucker's long and it's complicated, all this stuff. Like there was some planning involved. But in the mindset of Trump, when he was constantly talking about, oh, they stole the election, they did all these things, whatever, I could picture Trump putting in this document like one of those disruptions, like stealing an election. But he didn't do that when that was top of mind for him. And to me, that's a conscious choice because this whole thing was about that stolen election. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
We recognize and must prepare for the possibility of unforeseen events, including natural disasters, pandemics, cyber threats, and kinetic or electromagnetic pulse attacks. We must be prepared as a nation, as a federal government, and as individual citizens to preserve, protect, and defend our way of life. The strategy builds on the national continuity policy and provides guidance to the executive office of the president and federal executive departments and agencies to increase the executive branch's resilience. Our current and future prosperity depend on our ability to reduce the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure to cyber, physical, and electromagnetic attack. The government and private sector must work together to reduce vulnerabilities and design infrastructure that addresses preparedness and resilience from the start. The follow-on Federal Mission Resilience Implementation Plan will ensure that our nation's efforts and resources will be brought to bear in a coordinated manner through integrated continuity of operations and continuity of government programs interwoven into routine day-to-day government operations. Working together, we will prioritize the security, prosperity, and interests of the American people to confront the challenges of tomorrow. President Donald J. Trump, the White House, December 2020. 5. Summary. In accomplishing these goals together, we can ensure the resilience of our constitutional form of government and our American way of life. This is exactly what is at stake here. Donald Trump and the rest of the devolution patriots are fighting for the very soul of our country. Remember, this election theft is so much more than fraud. This is war. China wants to be the world's dominant power, but they knew they would never beat us in a war involving actual ground forces. Their only path to victory over the USA would be through infiltrating all of our institutions and destroying us from within. As you can see by what has happened since Biden was elected, they have never been closer to achieving their goal. At least that is what they think. The more research I do, the more peace it brings me. I have never been more confident that devolution is real. President Donald John Trump is a fighter. He saw this coming. He prepared for everything. He possesses a courage few could dream of. He was built for this moment. President Donald John Trump loves this country too much to let us be destroyed when there was something he could do to prevent that. So he acted. Devolution is real. Enjoy the show. The best is yet to come. Part 4 will be released Friday.
All right. So real quick, I just want to say thank you to, well, okay, actually one more comment. The part here about China, again, when I wrote this article, I was very much in the mindset that China was part of this, all the corruption and the ties between China and the Biden administration, the Biden family, the trade war stuff, the COVID. To me, China was like part of this whole thing. And maybe they still are, but I think this is one of the things that's evolved for me is my mindset of there's a bigger, group behind the scenes that's responsible for a lot of the stuff going on, not just here, but everywhere. And China is, like the good twin, evil twin that Chris talks about. China has that within their country too. And maybe they're not as directly responsible as I once thought, but we'll talk about this as we go on. Remember guys, I was like new to all this stuff. I didn't know any of the conspiracies, the cabal, the whatever. That wasn't my cup of tea, but I'm going to send you guys over to Culture Change here in a minute. I just want to read a couple Rumble rants. First from Blue Eyes 88, cash can't be connected to dev because it needs to stay separated from the Trump admin for the safety of patriots. Disinformation is necessary. Totally agree. Thank you. Call sign Cujo. John, don't forget to raid Culture Change. Ash said so, bro. And by the way, Blue Eyes 88, that's Abby. It's Brad's wife, Abby. And they did Liberty Den. They killed it on Liberty Den the other day. They have their own show. Make sure you guys are following her and her work. Divya 108, happy to watch this new series. I wouldn't have the patience to read it all. Thanks for the incredible amount of work you put into this and Badlands overall. Oh, and thank you guys. I'm very excited about this recap series. There's stuff that's clicking for me that I haven't thought of before. It's just all very interesting. So let me see if I can figure out how to go over to just locals. No, that's not how to do it. Okay, so I'm going to redirect it right now to just local supporters, and then I'm going to raid Culture Change. So if you guys are in the Rumble chat, make sure you click along to follow that. And so I'll see you guys over on Locals. If you're watching on Rumble, you can get over to Locals. Okay. God, this is so different from before. Okay, here we go. So at the bottom of the screen here, this big red join button, that's what you click to come over to Locals. It's going to be more like private, intimate Q&A with just those that are subscribed over there. So you guys have fun over on Culture Change, and we'll see you guys next time. Don't know when I'm going to do the next one of these, but I'll let you know. And I'll try to be more regular about it, but it's really difficult with my schedule at the moment. Okay, raid. Confirm raid. Okay, you guys head over there, and we're going to just Locals.